My name is Philip Kennedy, and I run the Institute Public Program, and it's a great pleasure for me to introduce an event led by a close friend, Mohamed Alhashimi, the Sha'ar Nabati, Sha'ar Sha'bi, whom I first heard about 3 years ago at an event organized by Maurice Pomerantz over lunch, I think. He treated us to, well, Maurice, that is, my colleague Maurice Pomerantz treated us to, in a conference and workshop about performance, to the performance of some poetry. So someone had the great idea of inviting Mohamed Alhashimi to that event, and I was absolutely inbahart, as they say in Arabic, mesmerized and by the beauty of the poetry that he recited, and it was, of course, his own poetry, and he provided translations. So ever since, we've kept up correspondence, and he was very kind this semester, during which I've been teaching a course on the Emirates, on the culture and the history and the future of the Emirates even. It's called From Prehistory to 2030. It's an unusual course, actually, when you go from the past to the future. But it's only in this country which had such a forward lean that you could do such a thing. In any event, there's a cultural component to the course, and so of course we've been reading the stories of Muhammad al-Murr and doing, to a large extent, some of the Nabati poetry. And it has been my idea really from the start that we provide with this course a parallel track of lectures for the public in general, because I think there's a great curiosity amongst the expat community about various aspects of culture and history of the Emirates. So we had in January a lecture on the Bainuna River, 7 million years ago, the latest news. It was quite an interesting. And then Mark Beach, the archaeologist, marine archaeologist, gave a lecture on the archaeological sites of the UAE. And we've had a lecture by Dr. Khaled al-Dhahri on the importance of tribal history, especially for the Banu Yas. Of course, when one studies the history of the Emirates, one knows a lot more about the north of the Emirates, Ras Al Khaimah and Julfar, than the south and the history of the Banu Yas. So it was very important to do for students to learn what are the origins of the history, the oral history of the Banu Yas. So this is the fourth lecture in that series, and there will be two more. I'm very pleased to announce that James Langton has agreed to give a lecture on a history of Abu Dhabi in photos. You know James Langton probably from the review section of the National, and the last lecture will be with a joint lecture with Dr. Frauke Herdbay and Zaki Nusseibeh, who will repeat a lecture that they offered the community during the 2 weeks of the Qasr al-Husn festival, about visitors to the Qasr al-Husn. So that'll take us to the end of May. In any case, the most important thing is to talk about Nabati poetry and to concentrate on Muhammad's work. Muhammad is well known in Abu Dhabi. He was a news anchor and producer for many years until he decided to resign, to change track in his life and concentrate on writing and publication. But he studied cultural policy and worked in the media for 12 years, and in fact is famous in the Nabati poetry milieu because he was the first host of Sha'ar Milyon until he decided to give that up. But he also is an accomplished poet in his own right, and it is really so that you can hear his poetry and hear Nabati poetry that we invited him here today. I think it's important for the community to be given an opportunity to hear what it is about the poetry that makes it so important to the community and its roots with its past. One cannot overstate how important Nabati poetry is to the Emirati community, the tribal community, and it's linked with oral history and stories that are akin to the battle days of the pre-Islamic Arab poets. Now, Mohamed, I'm conscious of going on a bit. He did ask me to say a word or two about the history of Nabati poetry and how really it's an important module, as it were, or it's an important factor or element in the history of Arabic literature in general. Because when one reads about Nabati poetry in the newspaper, one reads about it as if it's disjointed from or unconnected to the rest of the Arab world and to the rest of Arabic literature. Well, it's certainly not unconnected to the rest of Nabati poetry, by which I mean the Nabati poetry of the whole of the Arabian Peninsula. There's a huge tradition and a rich tradition of Nabati poetry in Najd, which has been very well studied by the Saudi scholar Saad Sawayan, and that's the main corpus that he has collected and published, and is from the 18th and 17th and 19th century into the 19th century. And it's what Saad Sawayan has been able to do through the study of the Najdi Nabati poetry is sort of is to write a chapter, an extremely important chapter in Najdi history, which is not necessarily the history that the Saudi institution likes to have recorded, but it's there and it should be recorded. There's a great danger that a lot of materials that exist orally will be lost if they're not recorded now or soon. And the same is true to a large extent also with the Emirates. There's a real prise de conscience of the importance of Nabati poetry in really being the repository of history, tribal history, tribal anecdotes, stories about the tribal law. Often, as in the earliest poetry, lore about conflicts between the tribes. Because in a strange way, and that's part of the atavism of this Nabati corpus with the earliest corpus of Arabic literature, which is, of course, the pre-Islamic corpus of poetry. I'm saying that the Nabati poetry is really the great avatar of that incredibly rich tradition of poetry. So here's the standard view of Arabic literature, that it starts with the Mulaqat and the great tribal poets of pre-Islamic Arabia in Hijaz and Najd and Yamama, and to some extent Oman, with the tribe of Azd-Oman and Hadramaut, and the Banu Kinda, of course. And the great poems were the Mulaqat, which, according to legend, though it's a legend to be debated, these Mulaqat were suspended on the walls of the Kaaba. That the tradition accepts this is really a statement of how important the oral poetry, and this was oral poetry, was to the community. What's interesting is that with Islam, the poetry continued into the Umayyad period, into the period of the Rashidun caliphs, into the Umayyad period, and grew really, but its roots was in pre-Islamic Arabia, a desert poetry essentially, with desert imagery. And it was then absorbed into Abbasid culture, but still a desert poetry with desert imagery, only stylistically different. By the 9th century, it came to be written down. So more and more the poets would record their own diwans, which was not the case in the earliest poetry. But what is important to emphasize is that this tradition of poetry that ends up in the poems of Abu Nuwas, say, or Mutanabbi, has become a written tradition and takes us all the way up to the 19th century with the neoclassical poets, who when they in the Nahda, when they revived sort of Arab national cultural pride, they revived a type of poetry which had this atavistic link with the poetry of the desert, and yet it was written by men of the city, people like Ahmad Shawqi. And it's only during the 20th century that the poetry changed radically, influenced then by people like T.S. Eliot and really the poetry of the West in large measure. So, but still, poetry in the 20th century had always inklings of its connections with pre-Islamic Arabia and the desert. So what happens in that history that I've just described, rather ponderously actually, is the standard history that one learns about Arabic literature. But there's another history that is sort of forgotten, which is that those pre-Islamic poems and the desert and the tribalism that they voiced and preserved orally for 2 centuries until they were written down, it really disappeared into the desert and continued latently in the desert until it resurfaced, say, in the work of Suwayan in the 18th and 19th century, among the poetry of the Najd. And so the poetry of the Emirates, the Nabati poetry of the United Arab Emirates, is not, what I'm trying to say, is not just a sort of a peripheral genre unconnected to the rest of the Arab world. Rather, it's the end product of a tradition that goes back to pre-Islamic Arabia. And there are a lot of images used very naturally in the poems of Sheikh Zayed and his epigones, if you like. There's a plethora of images that really are harking back, but feeling natural in harking back to the images of pre-Islamic Arabia. So that's all to say all to stress the importance of Nabati poetry, and to say that there's a sort of a half of the history of the literature of the Arabs that hasn't been written properly, I think. Certainly when I was taught Arabic literature at university, we were only taught the half that was written in the Abbasid period and continued onwards. But all the stuff that disappeared into the desert like water into the sand and then re-emerged as a blossoming, say, in the poetry of the Nabati poets, is not known. So, without further ado, we're going to hear a Nabati poet, a Sha'bi poet, talk to us and hear his I feel like saying cantillations, his chantings, it's a great pleasure to ask Mohamed to come to the podium and speak to you.
Assalamu alaikum. Good evening. Thank you, Phil, for the introduction, which is as cohesive as anyone would like it to be. And I think there is, except from the recitals that I will give the kind audience, there's no much more to say. Nabati poetry is some diversion of what we call the popular culture of the people of the peninsula. And if you start looking at Nabati poetry from that point of view, you will be able to understand why was there a difference between what is called Nabati poetry and popular culture or popular literature. There is all the Nabati poets are still saying that Nabati poetry is something different from Sha'bi poetry. And if you say that Sha'ar Sha'bi, it's different from saying that he's Sha'ar Nabati. Because Nabati poetry is something unique in its dialect, it's unique in its building, it's unique in its subjects, and its approach on certain issues, on the environment, on the atmosphere, on the surroundings, on the issues, on the political issues and social issues. So we will see in this presentation a glimpse on, because I'm not an academic on this subject, but I'm talking as a poet who has practiced this for many years and still is learning in the process about how does this come, where does this come from? Is it something that is bigger than what I expect it to be, or is it smaller? Because when you are practicing something, you would be proud that you're practicing it, and you would say that, well, what I'm doing is something unique, it's something special. It is the most important thing in the world, to you at least, and it should be important to others. Well, I collected some of the quotes that I found on the internet about poetry, and they are so interesting that they come from different places, but they still look at poetry the same way we do, here, there, and everywhere. Legion Liu said that poetry draws a picture to invite my eyes,
but still puzzles my mind. While T.S. Eliot said that poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. It is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality. I had something, I had to put something that I said in between, and I said that poetry originally is the abbreviated statement which fulfills the lot of talk. It prevails when it beautifies a crowded scene to the eye of crowd dissipation. And I said it in a poem that I recited in Sha'ar al-Milyon during one of the episodes. To start with the word Nabati, because it's there is a lot of argument about where does Nabati word comes from, because we do not have any connection with the word itself as a society. We are not Nabats. We do not come from the Nabat area in Medina, for example, in Saudi Arabia, in Hijaz. And we do not have any connection with the Nabatian civilization that settled in Jordan, in Petra. Maybe there is a connection between the origin of this kind of dialect, and that's what scholars said. They said that it originated from Nabat, or maybe from Petra, and then it took a diversion and it became a Bedouin associated kind of literature. But I think that there are three categories where we can look at Nabati poetry and say that it's significant to the literature, and it's different from what is called Sha'bi. When you say Sha'ar Sha'bi in Egypt, for example, you would imagine Ahmed Fuad Nigm, for example. Ahmed Fuad Nigm is not a Nabati poet. And when you say Umar al-Farra in Jordan, he is a Nabati poet. But there are no much difference. When you look at the two, they both look and their poetry look and sound the same almost, except from the fact that Ahmed Fuad Nigm is an Egyptian directed poet, and Umar al-Farra is a Jordanian Bedouin. But I think it's more of a Bedouin dialect. Nabati poetry is associated with the Bedouins most of the time. And when you take a look at the societies in the Peninsula, and in the Emirates, in Oman, in Saudi Arabia, there is also an existence of poetry, which is also Nabati poetry, but it's not associated with the Bedouins only, but also with people from the mountains, from the shores, from the coasts of the UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, but they are still giving their experience in terms of Nabati poetry. It is similar. There are poets who are very recognized as Nabati poets, but they do not come from the desert. So it's a dilemma. We cannot say that. I said that it's somehow Bedouin because I think that it started there. It started taking this significance in the desert. And because, as Philip said, even the Arabic literature is always connected to the desert. Even when they had the Abbasid civilization and also the Ottomans, even the Ottomans, it is a little bit different. But when you say the Umayyads, even in Andalusia, they still had this connection with the desert and everything that comes with it. A more specification is that Nabati poetry is geographically specified, because when you take a look at the Nabati poets in the current times, they mostly come from this region, from the Arabic Peninsula. But there are also Nabati poets in Mauritania, for example, in Morocco, in Yemen, in Jordan and Syria, in Chad, in South Sudan and North Sudan. But that has something to do with the tribes, because Bedouins do not stay in the same place. And some of them had settled in other areas in North Africa and in Middle Africa. And they took that with them. That's why we can find a Mauritanian poet who recites Nabati poetry, and he is a Bedouin, and he originates from this area, but he's not culturally connected anymore to the culture of the Arabic Peninsula. Saying that Nabati poetry is popular, something we can say about any kind of people's literature, like Sha'bi poetry, Nabati poetry, or folk music, folk games. You still see the popularity in this kind of literature. Well, we talked about this a little bit, and we said that there are three theories, and maybe more, about where the name Nabati came from. And some say that it's from a place called Nabat near Medina, and you can see in the picture, it is truly an extinguished civilization that settled there, and it was conquered by the Nabatians and the Romans once. Some other scholars say that it's by the people called Nabatians, who they were the first to practice, and they are the people of the Petra ruins in Jordan. And well, I read this, but I don't know who came up with the idea, but I remember reading this before, and some say that the dialect is called istinbat in the language, in the formal Arabic. It's called istinbat. It means taking something and making it something else. And maybe that's how the connection comes. Nabat, istinbat, it's the same meaning. There are some unique features in Nabati poetry that we can really notice. And that Nabati poetry is always, most of the time, it's spontaneous and it's direct. It always speaks frankly about what it sees and what it touches and how it deals with issues. You wouldn't say that the Nabati poetry is the same as this all the time. There are some modern attempts to involve other kinds of issue triggering in Nabati poetry. Now we can see some philosophical poems and some deep integrated poems with the new school of thought in the whole world. So, I even as a poet tried to knock the doors on certain issues, and some of them were philosophical more than them being direct and faltering. This Nabati poetry sought to create a simple style, combining artistic flair with clear, direct expression. The structure of the words is simple, and it's direct. It's not all the time hidden, and we call it in Arabic isti'ara makniya or tashbihat balaghiya. In Nabati poetry, there is no much of a craftsmanship making of phrases. So it's more like a simple, easy flowing phrases and words. Of course, Nabati poetry was not totally different from the classical Arabic poetry, and it had carried the characteristics and the style passed down from the civilizations that the Arab had, and also the Bedouins. It carried out these characteristics when it's called, Nabati poetry speaks about the desert, and as we said, it is always connected. These are the styles and subject matters that Nabati poetry triggers. Of course, they are the same as the classical Arabic, and we will witness in the examples that I will recite today how some of these are very, very common and very, very popular. Some of them weren't, actually. For example, if you say that riddles poetry was not commonly practiced, but after the United Arab Emirates Union, and Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid has carried on and sponsored the evolvement of Nabati poetry in the region. And he was one of the first Nabati poets who created a riddle which had a price of 1 million dirhams yearly. Yeah. You'd see that Arabic, some examples of some names of the Nabati poets who are very famous in the area. And I wouldn't say that these are the most famous, because I picked some of the names, and the society of the Arab Emirates has so many poets. And you could say that any society in the area has many poets, because if you say that there are 4 people in this majlis, one of them should be a poet most of the time. So some of the names are Ibn Dahr, and he's the most acknowledged poet, and he comes from the 16th century, which makes him the first known poet to the United Arab Emirates. Of course, there's Sheikh Mohamed bin Rashid, Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan, Rubai' bin Yaqut, Rashid al-Khadar, Sheikh Hamdan bin Mohamed al-Maktoum, the son of Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid, Usha al-Suwaidi, who's called Fatat al-Arab, and also there is Fatat Dubai, but we don't know her name, Rashid bin Tannaf, Salim al-Jamri, Ibn Atij al-Hamli. And Ibn Atij is one of the rare poets who we know about from the Liwa area in the desert. In Saudi, there are also many known poets, and you can see the names here. Most of the poets who are Nabati poets who are known now to the Saudis are emirs, and maybe because of the focus of the local press and local magazines about poetry on these names, but there are also many, and I think that there are more than 2 million poets in Saudi Arabia itself alone. If you compare it to other countries in the region, there is no comparison. Saudi Arabia has much more base of poets. From Kuwait, there is also many names who are also young, and that's maybe what distinguishes Kuwaiti poets from others. The new generation of poets coming from Kuwait are much more active and much more popular, becoming even popular in other countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Of course, there are in Qatar. I haven't mentioned Oman because the dialect of the Omani region is a little bit different, especially in the areas where near the capital and in South Oman. But there are also many Nabati poets living in the area between Muscat and the United Arab Emirates who write poetry in Nabati dialect. This is the first poem that I will recite today. It was by Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan, and it's about falconry. And I had the honor of reciting it in one of the lectures sponsored by NYU, and it was given by James Montgomery a few months ago. This one is called Ya Tayr. It's about a falcon. يا طير وظبتك بتدريب ودي أصاوع بك هدادي الذاريات من المهاريب لي ذايرات من العوادي القفلهن عساك ما تخيب واقصد لقايدهن عنادي خمه براسه خمة الذيب وعليك ما ظنيه بادي. There is also a poem by Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid al-Maktoum, and it was made into a song, a very famous song by a Saudi singer called named Abdul Majid Abdullah. This one is in Arabic called أذهلتني يوم صوبي مقبلة شفت موتي بين غدران وظلال لو بلف الكون كله بكمله البسيطة مدن وسهول وجبال ما رأت عيني جمال يخجله من جماله يختج الكون الجمال التدلل من دلاله دلله فيه مدلول الجمال بلا دلال جل من صور جماله وكمله كامل حسنه ولله الكمال. There's this one by Fatat al-Arab, and Fatat al-Arab was named Fatat al-Arab by Sheikh Mohamed bin Rashid because at that time there was a little bit discretion in announcing the name of the poet, a female poet, and a society still so intact and closed. Ushab bint Khalifa al-Suwaidi is one of the most active female poets in the decades between the 80s and the 2000s. Her poem is called يا شوق. يا شوق هالزنية هو الشوق هزيز غصن تاح الأوراق كل غرض من الوقت ملحوق إلا وصول الصاحب إشفاق قلبي لخزن الحب صندوق سيدي وافتح قفوله إغلاق سيدي وفتح قفوله إغلاق لصاحب من الهذر مرفوق ما تابع عد الجين لطفاق. Of course this one is a love poem as well as Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid's poem. This one was by Rabi' ibn Yagut, and Rabi' ibn Yagut is a unique poet because he had so many poems that discussed areas where other poets wouldn't. And this one is a very unique poem about corruption. It's named اسكت وخلي الحال مستور. يقول بن ياقوت اسكت وخلي الحال مستور كان اكتبه في بلادك تعيش معنى الرشاوي لاعبه دور معنى الرشاوي لاعبه دور كل شيء يقضى بالبخاشيش راعي الكوميشن سيس قصور شيكات وبنوك وتخشيش الا انت صار يا الغبي ثور مفلس ودوم تصيح ماميش. Of course this was written in the 80s I guess, and I think it would be more difficult now to write such a yeah, I wouldn't attempt something like this. This one is by Mohamed Abdullah al-Breaki, and it's also a criticism of the society, of the new generations of post-oil Emiratis, the young Emiratis who, after the booming of the economy of the UAE, they took a very, very extreme pleasure attack. And he says in this one, ساحة رقص, it's a dance floor called. يقول محمد البريكي الشعر أنثى والقصايد غواني يسوقها دلال في ساحة الرقص وإحنا بهايم ما عرفنا الأغاني ولا عرفنا كيف نصنع لنا قرص ترعى الخراف بحوضنا والمغاني وشياهنا تمشي وراها وترتص شبنا وشابت في العيون المباني والحارة اللي تضمنا جعلها القص. Well, he asked God to bulldoze it flat, the dance floor. I wouldn't say so. Mohamed Alhashimi is next, who is me. And this one of my poems that I recited in Sha'ar al-Milyon as well in the last episode. And I made it in Shalla. It was supposed to be a Shalla because it's deep, it's not direct, and it had a message. And I wanted to give a message to the audience in my last episode because I didn't announce that I will stop presenting Sha'ar al-Milyon in the second season. And I wanted to give that as a gift to all the audiences, to my audiences in Sha'ar al-Milyon. أقول Shalla is some kind of humming these words and making them more of a musical. Reciting is something more formal, yeah. موال, مثل الموال. In classical Arabic it's called موال, and in the dialect it's called شلة. And Shalla is a very popular art because it interacts with music, and it has become something that originates with the local music. Like, for example, there is a local singer called Aida bin Tannaf al-Minhali, and he started as a Shalla singer, and he is the poet who writes these Shallas. But then when he became a singer, he moved that significance in Shalla reciting with him to the music of the local culture. So you wouldn't differentiate the Shalla of Aida from his songs because it's almost the same. يقول Mohamed, I'm talking as a third person now. مسراي أرض تلوحاتي قمرها والحول دار ودرتنا في مكاني نفس المكان اللي لفاها هجرها ونفس المكان اللي بديت انتهاني درت في مداراتي وهي في أثرها تبقي على البعد وتلفح الأماني الشمس شمس وثابتة في مقرها والأرض باطنها كنوز ومعاني.
Now, you mentioned that Nabati is almost equal to Sha'bi or local, and that you trace that Nabati poetry to different parts of the peninsula in Jordan, in other parts of of Saudi Arabia.
Even in Sinai
desert. My mother tongue is Arabic, but I can find it very hard to understand actually your the meaning of the words. So does this mean that you can have some difficulty actually listening to other Nabati poetry from other parts of the region, or you find it actually easy?
It is possible. And I think that there are two explanations to the difficulty in understanding some of the other poetry from other countries in the region. Is that because every dialect of every country has took a very large diverse from its origin, which is classical Arabic. But to be honest, and I'm not saying that because I'm a Nabati poet, Nabati poetry has very strong connections with the classical Arabic, where other popular languages or dialects are not. For example, if you say that Egyptian dialect, it's more into other kinds of and it even carried words from the Pharaoh era, yeah. And but the Nabati poet is a Bedouin, and he's he's very strong and strongly attached to his roots, his Arab roots. So most of the words in the Nabati poetry are originally classical Arabic. But one thing that is trickery in that is the pronunciation. And when you say, for example, one of the poems that I recited today, صوبي, يعني Mohamed bin Rashid says, أذهلتني يوم صوبي مقبلة. صوبي means towards me. And in classical Arabic, it's صوبي. جاء صوبي، جاء الرجل صوبي. هي في اللغة العربية الفصحى موجودة. It exists in classical Arabic, but when Nabati poet says it, he says صوبي. So it's a little bit different, but it makes sometimes a very big
One
difference.
other short question. Is there any attempt on a regional scale to create like an organization to patronize the Nabati poetry and try to establish a framework for Nabati poetry?
Nabati poetry is a creativity of a free mind. I think we cannot control it, and we cannot tailor it to our needs or to our ambitions. But there are some institutions in the UAE that started taking care of the local poets, local poetry sphere, which is Academiyat al-Shi'r in Abu Dhabi, for example, and there is also Bayt al-Shi'r in Nabati in Sharjah. And in Dubai, there are many activities sponsored directly by Sheikh Mohamed or Sheikh Hamdan that really takes care of making the local poetry sphere very active. Thank you.
Shah al-Million really influenced and inspired a poetry contest that tried to model itself after that in Socotra in Yemen. And this went on for 5 years on very limited funding, actually people's own funds to put this on from 2005 to 2013. I was wondering if you'd heard of any other instances of this kind of modeling happening in other parts of the Arab world inspired by that program.
To imitate Sha'ar al-Million?
The format, and by having the local poets go up and perform and then win a prize and yes.
Yeah, it's interesting and it should be. There should be encouragement, and even by us to other societies in the region who are not as fortunate as we are, and we should encourage them to have such kind of enriching experiences. But I wouldn't overestimate Sha'ar al-Million. Sha'ar al-Million is more or less a TV reality show, and it's supposed to entertain people. It's not supposed to be a very influential part of how Arabic poetry or Nabati poetry evolves. It's something that to entertain people who are interested in such kind of literature. And as part of the origins of this program, I know for sure that Sha'ar al-Million itself copied, and actually I was the one who created the structure of the program in the first season, and it copied X Factors. Yeah, so it's no difference. It's no difference, and you wouldn't say that any kind of TV reality show is different to that concept, where people are the judge and the judges only manipulate and they give their words of wisdom about one contestant, but then it doesn't matter. It's up to the audience.
My name is Vincent Alhashimi. I'm from Stockholm, Sweden, and I'm an opera singer. And I'm very interested in this shelle technique of yours. Is it often that you sing the Nabati, and are there any rules on how you put music to the words?
I think it's a new experience, and it's still evolving. My shelle is not actually in the Nabati kind of, or the Bedouin kind of shelle's tones, or lahan, what do you call lahan? Yeah. So it's yeah, the tune. It's totally different, and when you say and when you track the origin of other shelle singers like Eid al-Minhali and other shelle singers in the UAE, you would say that they are more into the two categories, which is Taghruda and al-Malhoun. Al-Malhoun is a Bedouin kind of shelle. Mine is a little bit more into musical and more modern kind of shelle. If you're interested, you can find many references here that will have different kinds of shelle experiences, but mostly known as Eid al-Minhali, for example. Yeah.
It was beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, how did you learn this tradition? I presume you didn't go out with the Bedouin and spend several years there learning their poetry. How is this tradition maintained among urban educated people? And the second question is, so basically, how would you teach a young man or a boy who's interested in becoming a Nabati poetry? Would they apprentice to you and you would teach them that way? And the second question is, Phil Kennedy was making the point that Nabati poetry is connected to a long literary and classical tradition of Arabic, and we have to remind ourselves of that. But I would assume that Nabati poetry is not the only oral or performed genre of poetry that exists. And what is its relationship to those other forms of poetry? And I ask this question because I studied poetry in Yemen, and they have a very strong qasida tradition, but it's also connected to what they call the balah, which is composed spontaneously at wedding nights.
Oh, yes, yes.
And they
we
call,
have this.
and they call it the qasida al-balah.
Yes.
You know, and they also have zamil, which are shorter.
Zamil, yeah, it's known.
So if you have that too, I would love to know more about those and how and what their relationship is to Nabati poetry.
Thank you for the questions, which are very difficult to answer. I think it's difficult for me to answer because I'm not originally a Bedouin. I come from a Hashimite family, and Hashimis are more of living in urban areas, and I had to learn to recite in Nabati poetry, and I had several Bedouin friends and also local friends who originate years ago from this kind of literature and culture. It is not difficult, of course, to learn, and it's not difficult to master it, because it's another dialect of what you know. It's another way of pronouncing the word of which you know. It's the same as a classical poetry in terms of subject matter, and it's how to say. Again, I'm asking you the same question. What do you call بحور الشعر? Yeah, the meters. Yeah, بحور الشعر. The poetry meters are the same actually. There are some experiences, new experiences, which were and still happening in Arabic poetry, in classical Arabic poetry, and also in Nabati. But you would say that in classical Arabic poetry, it's more into modernizing the way poetry is written and making it more familiar with the European culture and the Western culture, as Phil said before. But in terms of Nabati poetry, it's more experimenting in what you are familiar with, in your environment, in your surroundings, in your experience with the evolving modernism and lifestyle. So instead of talking about the horse, in the 70s, most of the Nabati poets started talking about Land Cruisers. So Ya Ra'i al-Cruiser, it always starts with a cruiser. If they wanted anyone to advertise for them, they wouldn't pay a penny. They had like thousands of poems starting with the cruiser. Ra'i al-Cruiser, Ra'i al-Jeep, which the Jeep was very popular in the desert, and they counted on it. To answer your second question, which was, would you teach? I tried to teach one of my friends, and who was 10 years younger than me, and it's difficult, but it's rewarding. You would see how the improvement is going, and it's a very significant improvement in terms of what you see, what you get. Like at the start, he didn't know how to structure the poem, but within 2 years, he became a poet who recites in front of an audience like you. And it was rewarding, but I wouldn't repeat it again. I don't think that, yeah, I'm not patient. I'm impatient with students, and they annoy me all the time. And I tried actually, and it didn't work. The third question, which is about
two only. So the other one was the relationship to these other oral poems, these other kinds of oral poetry.
Yeah, there is, of course. And now, as me and Phil emphasized, I think it's very, very connected. And you can see that maybe a Nabati poet would brag and say that no, our experience is totally different, and we are, having our own. Yeah, we are proud, and we think that what we do is something really unique and should be appreciated in its own right. But I think there are large connections with the Arabic classical poetry and with the experiences of the modern societies. It is.
Thank you.
You talked about Nabati poetry being very direct. Are there any forms of Nabati poetry which takes into account or is related to the rules of tajweed, or the tajweed doesn't enter into any form of Nabati poetry?
I think every attempt to intersect, to have an intersection between poetry and Islamic teachings or Quran or tajweed would fail, because it's a very sensitive matter, and because part of our history is that we know that when Prophet Mohammed, peace be upon him, was preaching of the teaching of Islam to Quraysh tribe, they said that he's a poet. He made up these words, and it's his own poetry. So it's a very sensitive subject, and you cannot really involve the subject of poetry with the Islamic teaching or the Islamic heritage.
But there are certain rules in tajweed, the way you say the letters, the way you connect, Mad Alif, for example. There are many rules there, but these rules, it seems, are unique to Quran. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
You will not find them in Nabati poetry.
No. It's some kind of rules, a set of rules on how to recite the Quran and keep it very clearly heard, and that's why.
But they're linked only to tajweed, to Quran,
not to singing, for example. No.
It's totally different.
Although even Kulthum, when she was singing in classical Arabic, she tried to
Master the before, because that would give her like a space into her throat when she's singing.
Because there's a lot of discipline.
And ironically, one of my colleagues in journalism was a local journalist, was suspended from writing in local newspapers because he attempted to link between Kulthum's singing and the reciting of the Quran, and it was like a suicide attempt. Yeah, people don't like to see that kind of comparison happen. Yeah.
Thank you.
Shukran. Assalamu alaikum. I would like to ask my question in Arabic, please.
Of course.
Yeah. Okay.
I'll try to translate.
يعني بثمن جهود حضرتك في عرض هذا الموضوع المهم، ودعني أكون صريح معاك. هل تشعر بتخوف من انحصار الشعر النبطي، ولا سيما مع الجيل الجديد من الأبناء اللي هم بيتكلموا لغة عربية بالكاد الآن
بالكاد.
فدعني أكون صريح أيضا معاك أن هناك تخوف على اللغة العربية بوجه عام، ثم هناك تخوف على العاميات من الانقراض، حتى العامية، حتى اللهجات الآن أصبحنا نهتم بها.
صح.
طب ما بالك بالشعر النبطي، ولا سيما أن ما عرضته من شعراء النبط كلهم من الجيل القديم.
صح.
طب هل الأجيال الحالية اللي هي ولادنا الآن في المدارس وولادنا، هل هم بيستمتعوا بالاستماع للشعر النبطي؟ هل هم عندهم قدرة على إبداع الشعر النبطي؟ هل سوف يأتي يوم يصبح هذا زي أساطير الأولين، زي الشعر يعني لذلك أنا مع الدكتور محمد كاشف أن لابد يكون في مؤسسات ترعى الشعر النبطي بكل ما أوتيت من قوة، حفاظا على التراث العربي الإماراتي. حتى التراث الإماراتي، يعني معلش كنا في الماضي بنهتم باللغة العربية الفصحى، الآن انتقلنا، ده مش فصحى بس، حتى اللهجة. حتى اللهجة يا جماعة،
حتى اللهجة مهددة.
حتى اللهجة النهارده يا جماعة في ولادنا في البيوت بنتكلم معاهم بالإنجليزي، مش معاهم بالعربي. يعني حتى اللهجة أصبحت يخشى عليها من الانقراض، ما بالك بالشعر النبطي وهو يعني شيء يعني فني للغاية ونادر أصلا، يعني هو نادر الوجود أصلا. فهل تشعر بتخوف من ذلك الأمر؟ هل هناك يعني تصور أو مقترحات الحفاظ على هذا الفن الجميل من فنون الشعر الإماراتي. وشكرا.
شكرا لك. تبغيني أرد بالإنجليزي ولا بالعربي؟ Yeah. But I want to know if I'm supposed to answer in English or Arabic. Yeah. Okay, the question was about preserving the language or even the dialect, because it's even challenged nowadays because of the modern and Muslim invasion. And to be honest, my opinion is a totally, you're not going to be pleased with my opinion, but I hope that I made myself clear and make you understand my point of view. I think that dialects are a changing thing. It's not something that you can keep in a chest and say that, well, I'm going to preserve this and it's going to stay like that forever. Dialects change because they are dialects. They change with the times, with the lifestyle, the environment, the way we live, the way we socialize, the way we see things. And maybe if we are to preserve the language, what would we call the car, for example? We wouldn't call it sayyara. We will need to make up a word that has roots into the motor. And in the local dialect it's called motor, which is connected to the English word. But I think preserving the dialect is not important. The dialect should be changing, should be evolving, should be enriched with other civilizations and other countries, and I see that the new generation, and I hope I am one of them. I'm young, but but I think that we don't write Nabati poetry the way Bandahar is writing it, or Rashid Al-Khadar, or even Rashid Sharar, who's still alive. This one I'm sure is still alive because I met him. And Rashid Sharar doesn't write Nabati poetry the way I do, or one of my friends. And one of them is a contestant in Sha'ar al-Milyon season 2. And I think that we are similar in the way we approach Nabati poetry. We write more into philosophical issues and into how life is important and how good morals is important, the ethics and the principles of life. I think that's not what a Nabati poetry would be writing all the time in the 19th or 18th century. And I think because there was no need for such preaching or such. I wouldn't say that I'm preaching in my poetry. I say that I'm asking myself questions, and I have so many questions to ask. Where do we come from? Is this what we are supposed to be having, or is this the faith? Is this many questions? And you know how the modern life brings the worst of you. It's totally normal to have a changing dialect, and it's important to have an evolving Nabati poetry experience. Some of the people from the Nabati Poetry Society, even in institutions like Academia Tishar, they do not like this. They wouldn't say that. Well, they would say that we have to preserve the dialect, as you said, but I don't think it's right. It's not their own right. It's not our right to change it. It's not their right to keep it. It's about how would an audience receive it and how touching your poetry should be. And it's not, even if it had some few English words.
One more question. Yeah,
sure.
عودة للغة العربية. معلش يا جماعة، أنا عضو المجلس الدولي للغة العربية ومحظور علينا استخدام اللغة
متشرفين
عليها. فهو أنا بس عندي تجربتين في جامعة الحصن على موضوع التراث الشعبي الإماراتي. احنا عملنا مسابقة تراثية فيها الكلمات الشعبية القديمة لدولة الإمارات، وطلبة الجامعة، احنا جامعة الحصن يمكن تلتينها مواطنين. تخيل ان يعني معظم اللي دخل المسابقة لا يعرفون الكلمات القديمة نهائيا، يعني والجيل ده 18 سنة 19 سنة 20 سنة
It's a new generation.
لا يعرفون كلمة من كلمات التراث. عملنا مسابقة هذا العام تراثية أيضا فيها شلات وفيها يعني اللي هي الشعر النبطي، وزعناها على الطلبة عندنا في الجامعة يمكن 1600 1700 طالب، اللي استجاب لينا 21 طالبة. فسألنا ليه يا اخواننا؟ قالوا بصراحة فيها كلمات صعبة ما احناش فاهمينها، وهؤلاء من مواطني الإمارات. فلذلك أنا متخوف على يعني على التراث الشعبي الإماراتي. شكرا.
Preserving heritage, because this is part of my studies in cultural policy and management. We had to understand how, as a public service, public sector, where you put the planning and strategic objectives for any country in terms of cultural movement. There is always a challenge that you put aside your heritage and you say that it's not important. Most of the countries in the world, even in the United States, they have their own definition of heritage and that they want to preserve. And to preserve that is something very, very important. It is essential for any evolving society. But I don't think that this is the thing that we should just focus on and forget that, well, we have to change a bit. We have to learn more about others and about ourselves. We can why don't we change? There is no country in the world that was speaking the same language or having the same culture or having the same habits or traditions that for even more than 600 years. You cannot say that. It's against reason and against logic. Yeah, that's the question of identity, which is a totally different thing. It's not about preserving tradition. It's about keeping your roots, your identity roots.
My opinion on this subject of because Dr. Mohamed was talking about a competition in the Alhashimi University where the students were asked questions about the Arabic language, and there was a high percentage of ignorance, which was disturbing to you and to presumably your colleagues. And I think I agree with what you say about dialects dialects evolve naturally. I mean, Italian is what it is, and it's not Latin. It used to be Latin, but people who speak Italian can write it and read it. So what's important for a language, if it evolves, is that there is a literary competence and a proper ability to express yourself in writing. And what I fear is that in what's happening is there's a hybrid, wishy-washy middle state of affairs where people speak a bit of Arabic, but they can't write it or read it. Right. And that's not good. Whatever the dialects evolved into, it's important to, if you speak Arabic, you should be able to read and write it. And if you and speak it correctly, yeah.
There's this shella, and it's the poem was recited in one of the conferences we had, and it's about it is from a philosophical point of view about how we see distance and how we explain our missings and our disappointments, about love. It's called Sarab al-Lal. Sarab al-Lal is the mirage, the mirage of the desert specifically. أطرد سراب اللال وتغطي الغيوم نجوم وشقق ثياب الظلام البعد والحاجة والشوق يغتال السكون ويستغيظ النوم يسبب أسباب الظلام ويضوي سراجه. وأنا على خبري قبلت بقسمة المقسوم، لكن تغريد الأمل عودني أدراجه. عيني على ضوح الغياب وخاطري مقسوم، بينك وبين اللي هداه اسراه معراجه.